Okay, today it's a good old-fashioned tub-thumping, what we used to call Thud and Blunder adventure. Except this is no Thud and Blunder. It was called Thud and Blunder by those of us who read, mostly read science fiction. I mean, there were people who read. This is still true, where people tend to prefer to read fantasy or they prefer to read science fiction, and that those fields have overlapped, and there's been a fusion between them, and there's steampunk, and there's all kinds of other punk, and they should have punk, a new genre with one person writing one story. It's one of the bizarre things. People talk about Afrofuturism in science fiction. And there actually really isn't any such thing. It's bizarre. It was created by this critic who wrote about a couple of, like he wrote about Samuel Delaney, and who's a African-American science fiction writer who's also queer. And I don't know, like Octavia Butler. There were not many science fiction writers of color, which was an interesting thing. That this was, not, you would think that this would be a useful genre. But anyway, for people who were, caught under the wheel. Anyhow, Afrofuturism. Yeah, it was basically was created holus bolus by some academic critic, and then people went on referring to this one journal article about Afrofuturism as if it was the thing. It's like, no, actually, there was no such thing. There was no group that was there. Anyway, blah. So back in the day, when science fiction was science fiction and fantasy was fantasy, there were the beginnings of people who treated fantasy as if it were. They mash it up with other genres. Now we've done this. Now this has been all over the place. The genres are all over, but you can still find what is called hard science fiction, and you can still find what is called high fantasy. And high fantasy tends to be a world where magic works and where technology is either low or non-existent, or sometimes both, but it's usually one, not the other. And there's sort of a Bronze Age technology, so Game of Thrones, but with a bit more magic happening, a little bit less stabbing and killing. And that's the stuff that's considered to be Thud and Blunder, right? Blood and thunder. And so, I mean, it was pretty cheesy. And then finally, by the late 60s, people were like, that we can do better than that. Well, the book I'm talking about today comes from just around that time. And it's a famous book, and it started a whole, in the end, I think he wrote 10 books. And so the author's name is Roger Zelazny. And I don't actually have, I don't have any Zelazny's books with me here. So he's Russian. The name is Russian, and it's Zelzany. No, that's wrong. You got that wrong. First try. Zelazny. 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 That's right. Yeah, Roger Zelazny. And you can. The books I'm talking about are known as the Amber books, the Amber Chronicles, variously. I can show you a picture of. There was a particular moment where science fiction writing moved from being sort of pulpy to being artistic. And it shifted over basically in the 60s. It began to shift, where science fiction began to be taken seriously by people who were interested in a whole bunch of different things. And another discussion for another day. Zelazny was one of these guys who took different genre, like he would take something like a hard-boiled detective genre and the character, from a hardboiled detective story. So it's a, laconic, wisecracking, I was sitting in a, down my dump on 33rd planet of the outreach of Barsoom when the dame walked into my office. So it's the same story, but basically it's set in some science fictional world. And there have been people who have had a lot of success with this recent kind of mashup. The most person who is probably the most visible to you easily is Richard Morgan, who had success with Altered Carbon. And Altered Carbon was exactly this. It was a combination of smart science fiction ideas and a whodunit and a private investigator, sort of, who's got a dark past, and he's got special skills that you don't find out about until he begins to use them, and it turns out that he's not just an ordinary man, and that kind of thing. And Takeshi Kovacs is sort of one of these very interesting characters, and that was a really successful mashing up of sort of a bunch of genre, a hard-boiled detective and a mystery story and hard science fiction, where he really thinks about what would the world look like if you could have a cortical stack in your neck which would back up your brain to it every, say, 24 hours or something like that. And then you could re-infuse this person. I'm going to talk about that tomorrow because I'm just thinking about it. It's a great scene where Takeshi in one of the books has basically he has two selves, and he has to let the stronger self win. It's quite the scene. They're digital selves. Anyway, but today it's good old times. So I'm showing you here a Jeff Jones painting. This is one of the most gorgeous paintings I have ever seen in my life. I honest to God, I never saw it. Like most of these paintings, I've only ever seen them on book covers. And I adore, this book cover is actually a pocketbook. And so there's Zelazny, Z-E-L-A-Z-N-Y, Zelazny, not Z-E-L-Z-A. And so this is the doors of his face, the lamps of his mouth, which, as I recall, is a discussion of Leviathan. I think that's the discussion of Leviathan from the book of Job, where he describes the forces that God has arrayed in the world, and one of them is this sort of creature, which is unknown. Many's the doors of his face, the lamps of his mouth. This is sort of incredible. It's just this creation. Anyway, and then it's the story that Jones illustrated here is A Rose for Ecclesiastes. And so you can see this character who has a rose in. It actually looks like a woman, but it's actually a man's hand. It could be a woman. Yeah. It could be a woman because he gives her a flower. He gives her a rose. And Jeff Jones is one of the most gorgeous painters that lived. This is a book about him. Although Sophie. I can't remember what. Oh, I'm sorry about this. I can't remember what her name was. He identified variously as a man, as a woman. Transition didn't. It was tough. It was a very unhappy, very sad situation because, Anyway, it's really a shame because she was not happy as a man and not happy as a woman, and tried to go back to being a man, and then killed herself, and it's just a shame. It's just hard. So, but she says at one point, because somebody was interviewing her and said, "Why don't you call the artist?" I think her name was Sophie Jones or something like that, and she says, "No, because Jeffrey did all the painting. I don't paint." And so it was. It was as I say, it was a serious, one of these just very, very sad stories. Anyway, but Jeffrey Jones, as a painter, was one of a group of very famous painters who sort of started off as, they brought, in the same way that science fiction people like Roger Zelazny were bringing good writing and good idea, like not good ideas, but higher literary merit, basically, to science fiction, and making it clever and making it astute and making the writing more beautiful. And at the same time, artists and illustrators were bringing this kind of art, of high art, to science fiction book covers. So there's this very interesting renaissance, or really, well, no, it was a renaissance. It was a rebirth, really, of art and the art of the art and the art of the science fiction at the same time. So the painting I'm going to show you here. So this is Jeff Jones again in a different book, and you can see on the right hand side, you can see these paintings which are very. Again, I need to drill a hole in these books so I can look through them. I'll just stand. So if you see, yeah, okay. So here you can see on the right hand side, these are typical. Like somebody said to Jones, to Jeffrey Jones at the time, please do us a Frazetta cover. He's like, oh, okay, you need, women with in suggestive positions and men with this is why it's called Thud and Blunder, right? Because it's that's what it is, right? It's all books for boys. People holding their swords. Oh yeah, we know they're their swords. Wink, wink. But on this side is this gorgeous damn painting. Look at this thing. Oh my God, it's so beautiful. I'll get my fingers out of the way. Now, this is called the Black Rose. And look at that detail. I mean, look at the wonderful sort of atmospheric stuff there in the castle and the clouds and this sort of dreamlike other reality, which is just this sort of amazing. And here's this beautiful black charger, right, with these skirts, these like white, presumably silk skirts on this knight who has this white shield with the black rose on it, on a lance, and he's just, and who knows, who knows what's happening? I mean, is he charging into the lists, or is he like, who knows? It's just this amazing image, and the vertical of the lance and the vertical of the castle is just, you cannot, and the vertical of the trees on the right hand side. My right-hand side, you can't beat that composition. It's just like, bam, bam, bam. It's like, wow, the verticals are so strong. With that gorgeous quarter of a hemisphere in there, what would that be? An octosphere. Just a beautiful cover. Well, that cover was on Roger Zelazny's Nine Princes in Amber. And the Amber books were the beginning of an early, very early science fiction franchise. I just ordered a copy of the what's called, I think, the Big Book of Amber, which is all the novels. And I my sister and I read these. Oh man, we read them and read them and read them and read them. And so this Corwin character named Carl Corey wakes up on Earth, and I think he wakes up in an asylum, and he gets out, and he spends some time with his sister. He goes to see his sister Fiona, and he's sort of this wisecracking. Well, yesterday I was talking about the Man with No Name. He effectively is that character. This became the hero of the late 60s and early 70s, was very often in America, but also in Britain, was very often this sort of enigmatic drifter who kind of blew into town and set things straight and blew out of town, broke a few hearts and moved on. And but these books were interesting because they came out when second wave feminism was beginning to have an impact culturally on everything, which means that they weren't, if they were macho, and they weren't as macho as they might have been earlier, the women were equally tough and strong, and so it was a very different landscape. And this is when the still famous feminist authors like Ursula Le Guin, not Sherry Tepper, although she began just around then. Susan Cooper, Leigh Brackett was still writing, Andre Norton, a bunch of people began to basically write, different kinds of characters. Patricia McKillop, the woman who wrote about the dragons, the Dragon Riders of Pern, Anne McCaffrey, who was sort of a romance writer. And this is part of the point, is that romance also got into this. So romance and fantasy began to join up, but there were also romance and science fiction. And so it was a very interesting time to see things happening like this. Anyway, Nine Princes in Amber benefits from this. So Corwin, who was the character we will know as Corwin eventually, Carl Corey, starts out on Earth, and when he's with his sisters, in his sister's place, Fiona's place, in New York, I think they're in New York, he comes across a deck of tarot cards. But the tarot cards are familiar to him. Like, he looks at the people and he recognizes them. And as he looks at the cards, some of the images start to move. And he makes contact with some of the people in the cards. And he thinks he must be going nuts. So he slowly begins to remember, like, what happened? What happened? What's going on here? There's a bigger reality here. And almost every fantasy book, and really most sort of alternate Earth books and so on, or adventure books now, owe a debt to a few basic kinds of texts. They owe a debt to Tolkien and to the Lord of the Rings sort of quest, dark side of the planet, light side of the planet, multiple Earths, multiple peoples in the Earth, kind of that kind of thing. And those would be things like Lord Fowl's Bane and the Terry Good, whatever they are, novels that came out, Goodkind, I think. Terry Brooks, the Shannara books. And then there's the Narnia books. And the whole of the Magicians, which was a series of 3 books by Lev Grossman. And the novels are actually really quite good. The series has been a little, it's been disappointing because they put some money into it, but not enough. Anyway, all of the major fantasy work that's being done now owes a debt to these basic stories. And one of the series, books, images, that is the overall image that they owe a debt to is Nine Princes in Amber. And Nine Princes in Amber is the name of the first book in the Amber series. And that's the cover that I just showed you with the black rose with a knight on it. And it's such a beautiful cover. Those covers were so astonishingly gorgeous that for a good long time, I would, unless it was like Tarzan or something like that, which I couldn't read. I mean, it was just so boring. I would buy just about anything that had a Jeff Jones cover on it. It had a beautiful painting, I'd buy it. And I'd be so disappointed. I was like, oh, why isn't this another Nine Princes in Amber? That's what happens when you read, when you're buying covers when you're 12. You're like, I think that's what I think marketers are after 12-year-olds fundamentally. 12-year-olds who are still maybe 40 and have enough money to buy stuff. And you're like, we got that 12-year-old self. You're like, oh, look at this. I'm going to buy it. And they're like, oh, I'm disappointed. Well, by the time you're 14, you're like, I see a beautiful cover, but it's by so-and-so. We know the book will be terrible. No, I won't buy it. I have bought books for covers, though. Regretted it, but I bought the books for the covers. Anyway, but in this case, the cover perfectly fits this sort of open world of like wonder and amazement, and it's just amazing. So Corwin eventually begins to, so he hears about this other world, and he convinces one of his brothers, I think, he meets one of his brothers, to take him to Amber. Now, I haven't read Nine Princes in Amber again for, I don't know, at least 10 years, maybe more. So, as I say, I've got this big, thick thing coming. And I know my sister has one of these. I got it for her. I was like, oh, look, all the Amber books in one place. We have to have that. So I got it for her, and she's like, oh, my God. By the time she got to the end of it, she's like, 1,000 pages of I'm trying to remember. There's a name for, he shifts from one world to another, and Zelazny sort of took this chance to write these Whitman-esque sort of poetic acid trip 2 or 3 pages of these, and they're just like, oh, it must have been fun to write them, but when you're reading them, you're like, oh, because it's incredibly image rich, and it's sort of like, then this happened, and it's all sort of, like there was a spray of sparks and it rose to my thighs, and then, a festoon of, petunias that were a mile high. And you're like, oh, okay, yeah. Any one of those images would be enough for like a whole, you're like, oh, I'm full. That's a great image. I'm full. But there's like image. So when you're reading 2 or 3 pages of this, after a while, you're like, oh, okay, next. Let's get to the story here. Come on, Roger. And Zelazny was a very charming guy. He was a fencer. He was another one of these people who just sort of, very bright, like Bester. And Zelazny learned from Bester. I mean, you can see, that it was Bester, and then Zelazny came along. It was the next generation of, sharp young guys. And he was a fencer. He, was a polyglot. He worked as a diplomat, I think. Oh, no, that was Keith Lomer, pardon me. He was in some kind of civil service job. Who knows what that actually means. Could have been intelligence, don't know. And then he began to write full-time, and I think that was it. I think he was a full-time writer. And at the time, they were paying so little for science fiction novels that you had to sort of write two or three science fiction novels a year, which is why Philip Dick, for instance, wrote so many bloody books, because he had to crank them out. He was in California, and he kept getting married to people. And California at the time had the most equitable divorce laws that there were in the country. So he'd get married, and then he'd get divorced, and the women wouldn't have, weren't trained, didn't go to college necessarily, didn't have skills. So they'd sue for, or they'd settle for, money from the estate or money from him. And he'd have to crank out these books. So he was writing like 3-4 novels a year, all 150 pages, like short books, right? So Zelazny was part of this sort of crank them out, write 2 books a year, and you're like, oh, great, a new Zelazny. And it really was something to look forward to. And there's something about that. I have to say that these big books now, where it takes somebody, say 3 or 4 years to write a book, like Patrick Rothfuss is writing, not The Name of the Wind, maybe it is The Name of the Wind, and then A Wise Man's Fear is the second book. Those are really good books. I mean, those are good fantasy books. They're smart, they're interesting ideas. It's high fantasy, and so on. It takes itself pretty seriously, but it's good. It's well written, good characters and so on. Well, they're all, 1,000 pages, 800 pages long, and it means that it takes time to write an 800-page book. I mean, it's going to take you 4 or 5 years. So he publishes his latest book. We read it, and then you're like waiting for another 4 or 5 years. As opposed to having the person write, say, a 150-page book, 2 a year. You're like, well, that's pretty good, actually. It's not bad, because then you're like, oh, I'm looking forward to the next book by Patrick Rothfuss. Well, the problem there, of course, is that it's bloody hard to come up with a new idea every 6 months for yet another book. And it's like, that's going to get tiresome pretty quick, which is why a lot of the Philip Dick novels are so short, but also repetitive, not in the way that they are, it's not exactly the same book, but the same ideas are going to come up, because fundamentally, human beings, for the most part, don't have an endless supply of ideas. I mean, some few people do, but most of us work from the same group of ideas and thoughts, and we're going to return to those, and they'll slowly change as we get experience, but which is why, like, if you looked at, and we'll do this one day, I mean, I'll talk about Jeff Jones another day, but if we looked at this Jeff Jones book, you'd find, a lot of the same kinds of images. Not because they were driven by commerce, because he got to a point where he didn't have to, crank out book covers. He stopped painting book covers, which was a great shame for the rest of us. But because those were the ideas that are in his head, it's like, that's what you're going to get. Anyway, Iron Princess and Amber. So Corwin starts off with his brother. My memory is Blaze, I think, but I could be wrong about that. And they start driving to Amber, and because he doesn't remember how to get to Amber, and the brother says, "Well, the answer to your lost memory is going to be in Amber. We have to go there." And he's like, "What's Amber?" And he's like, "Okay, you don't remember? All right, well, I have to go." So they start driving, and the sister Fiona has a Mercedes. So they get in this Mercedes and they start driving. And then the car changes color. And they stop for gas, and the gas turns out to be, I can't remember, like perfume, like they're pumping perfume into the tank. And then the car changes color again, and then it has wagon wheels, and so the car begins to shift into all these, and he realizes, and you begin to realize, they're driving through different realities. What's going on? And as they get closer and closer to Amber, things shift more dramatically until finally, and then they begin to stabilize. So they begin to stabilize in a sort of typical sort of fantasy world where it's like people are riding horses, they're there are dogs, and it's a sort of medieval world, Bronze Age. An Iron Age, I guess, the Iron Age, yeah. So there are smiths, and there's science, which is sort of like 16th century science. Galileo. There's those sort of Leonardo's been working, Galileo's been working. That we're sort of at that level of science, and then things kind of stop. And so you have to be good with the sword, and you have to be good with the bow and arrow, and you're going to be dressed in the livery of the. Because I was talking about this with The Star Is My Destination, right? That Preston, in his household, sets everybody up in a livery. Okay, so you're going to wind up looking like a courtier and so on. And the images and the descriptions of the clothing are beautiful. I mean, Zelazny had this gorgeous, he had this very vivid, painterly eye, so that when he wrote, and it's short. I mean, he's also a minimalist, so. You'll get a one sentence description of somebody, and you're like, you just get them. You just they're very, very interesting and beautifully drawn in that way. So they get in, they begin to arrive, and as they arrive in Amber, they arrive in the forest of Arden, and the trees are bigger, everything's broader, the colors are richer. So this is the real world, apparently, and. Now, the idea about Amber, if you remember your geology, which I do not, but somewhere along the line, you learn about various things, whether you know geology or not. And amber, as you remember, is resin, which is, over the course of thousands of years, hardened into what appears to be a stone. It's not actually a stone, but it doesn't go back to being resin, basically. So it's this beautiful amber color that is its sort of dark orangey, sort of kind of rusty orange color, and sometimes quite clear, sometimes cloudy. Depends on what's in the resin, basically. Sometimes you'll see an insect caught in amber, because it was sap, basically resin, right? If you think about like maple syrup really is the reduced sap of the maple tree. It's sort of like if you could take a ball of maple syrup and have it become a stone. That's how you get amber, right? So you can see where it would be sticky, and that if an insect got stuck in it, they wouldn't be able to get out. So often you'll have amber which will have insects stuck in it, which will be thousands of years old, insects that are thousands of years old. And so it's very much it's valued for that. It also has this very warm, amber has a very warm quality to it, because you can rub it, and it's because it's not a mineral. Well, everything's a mineral, I guess, if you try hard enough. But it has this enormously warm, rich quality to it. So why amber? Are these princes and so on, and the main characters caught in amber, or is what's going on with that? So they come into the forest of Arden, and I can't remember what their Mercedes has become. I think it's become a coach and four, and they hear dogs. They hear a hunting horn, and the brother says, "Oh God, it's Julian. He's hunting," and they start racing. And there's a race right at the beginning between the coach and the horses and the dogs. And the dogs, and these are real monster dogs. They're sort of like Irish wolfhounds, just super tall. These are the kinds of dogs that a friend of my father's had, Irish wolfhounds. And you'd go to visit, and they'd come in and sniff your armpit. They would just be walking. You'd be walking around. They'd be like, they're at this height. They're just big, tall dogs. Beautiful, beautiful, quiet, calm dogs. Unless they're hunting you, you don't want that. And who wants that? So Julian finally stops the carriage, and they have a standoff. And this is the first idea we get that things are not well, although we've known that there's a problem. So Corwin slowly finds his way into the heart of Amber, and he finds out that he's apparently at war with his brother Eric, who has seized the crown. And there are 9 princes and princesses. That is, there are 9 inheritors to the crown in Amber. And Corwin is one. Corwin is one. And so he begins to realize that, so he decides, okay, he's going to go to war with Eric. And he does, and, trouble ensues. And it's very much, again, a sort of Count of Monte Cristo story. I mean, he gets picked up, he gets put in prison, he has to get out, and he uses these tarot cards, and he realizes they use these tarot cards to travel to each other, so they can make contact with each other through these tarot cards, and then they can go into the card wherever the person is. The personal touch will bring them through, and they come into there. So it's a lovely sort of idea, and the guy who has made the cards turns out to be sort of this. Apparently, he's a sort of mad inventor, so he's sort of this Galileo, Leonardo kind of mashup who invents magic things for the household. So the first book of Amber ends with Corwin basically on his way. He gets free, and he's on his way to a new destiny, which then plays out over the next. I think there are 10 books in all. I often stopped around book 6. I think because really I just at that point was doing other things, and I was like, oh, I gotta keep on working. Hence, that's why I've ordered this big book, because I'm like, okay, I still have my little paperbacks. I love them. I adore them. The second book, The Guns of Avalon, is again a very intriguing book, and it's a hugely worthwhile sequel. But the cover was not as beautiful. It's too bad they didn't get Jeff Jones to do the cover. It's always a shame. And then by the third book, they'd gone to this designer who unified the covers across all the Zelazny. Somebody decided to re-release all the Zelazny books, and they used this very heavy these black covers with this. They used Futura or I think it was Futura, or Gale Sans, I think. And it's this serious grotesque font. I mean, it's a nice font on its own, but it's like, it's a bit heavy, and so there's sort of small image. Anyway, not my taste. But that was kind of it for the beautiful art. It's like, they took the art, they get some woman to do a painting, artist to a painting, and then they turn it into this little nutshell. It's like, thanks. But there is this, Corwin is this wisecracking, smart-ass sword fighter. So I was reminded of this, and I was thinking about this because of talking about Yojimbo yesterday. And this is sort of, it's interesting because Zelazny liked Japanese art. He actually has, in one of the books, Corwin goes back to Earth, to the Earth reality, to get a painting or a black and white ink sketch that he had which was Japanese. Now, Zelazny was interested in the East, and he wrote about it, and he put Eastern mysticism into his books, and he put South Asian mysticism into. He wrote Lord of Light, which is sort of just capitalizes on the sort of interest that Californians particularly had in South Asian mysticism, Buddhism, the whole pantheon. I mean, very much Zelazny was interested in different pantheons. And I think it should be Panthea, Panthei. And so he and Lord of Light is a smart book. Turns out there's a trick to it's not just the Indian or South Asian gods, the Krishna and Shiva and so on. It's not just those. It's like, oh no, there's more to it. There's always more to it with Zelazny because he was a clever guy, and he was also a really fine writer. So Corwin at one point, in I think at the second book, he says, they numbered, he's talking about the enemies, he said they numbered, 20,000 in the field with this many, dragons and blah, blah, blah. We numbered, 5,000 and we had stout hearts. Yeah. This is sort of wonderful. It's like fantasy with this, it's like, what if there were actual people who had a sense of humor in fantasy? Because one of the things about fantasy is nobody has a sense of humor in fantasy. They're all riding around, they're all very serious, and everything's desperate. Nobody ever has a laugh. It's like, could you please have a bloody laugh? It's like, oh, no, they're all straight up. So that's why it's kind of nice to see. That's why George R. R. Martin, it's nice to see in one of the seasons of Game of Thrones where what's his name? The little person. I'm sorry. He's such a good actor too. I can't remember. Michael says the counselor, like the brother who is also the smartest of them, the counselor, says to Grey Worm and the translator, well, let's tell a joke, and they're like, joke, what is this? So then she tells a joke and it's about translators. That's great. And they're like, they're just sitting there. She's like, it was funny because, they're all like, no, they don't get it. It's charming. And there was, for the first time ever, people laughed in fantasy. They made smart remarks. They went to the bathroom. And the thing about fantasy is that it's based fundamentally in the idea of the Middle Ages, the world of the Middle Ages, of the Iron Age, basically, which was hugely about the body. But fantasy is all cleaned up. Everything is beautiful. It's like sort of like Cinderella. This is where Disney's fantasy is what everybody had in mind for fantasy. It's like no. The idea, everything. The world was a dirty, disgusting, very bawdy, BAWDY place. It smelled bad, and people had sex all the time, and they died young, and they had these terrible diseases, and they drank and to excess, and it's much more Shakespeare, than it is Disney. Well, Zelazny knows this, and he was a poly, as I say, he was a poly. He spoke many languages. Polyglot is the word I think I'm looking for, and multilingual. Okay. And he read widely, and he brought those reading in. So there's this smart-ass sensibility to Corwin. And so he begins this war against Eric, and it turns out. Now, the idea, really what's interesting about Amber, and this is sort of the bigger picture, is that by the end of the third book, because a trilogy was really, that was a lot. I mean, people were like, oh, that's enough. I don't want to read any more about that. New ideas. So the trilogy, the first trilogy in Amber is Nine Princes in Amber, The Guns of Avalon. And it's very clever because when they shift out of Amber into the other worlds, and sometimes Corwin goes to different worlds like that are not Earth, or he goes to other Earths that are almost Earth, but it's not quite Earth. And he's unfazed by it. He's, in this Earth, people had claws, and it was almost my Earth, except that everybody was green. It's just like, oh, it's wonderful. They were flying, whatever. And he wants to go back to Amber with a trick. And so he has to go and get from Earth Jeweler's Rouge. And you're like, what is he going to do with Jeweler's Rouge? What is that even? So you have to look that up. Now, at the time, when we read these books, there was no web. So what was Jeweler's Rouge? It's like, so you'd ask people, he's like, do you know what Jeweler's Rouge is? And people say, oh, I know what it is. So you actually had to ask people, which is interesting. One of these things about novels and reading was that it was, when there wasn't the web, it produced, either you said nothing, which was very common, or you asked people, what was that? Hey, do you remember? Have you ever read? Da-da-da-da? No, what's this? I've heard this joke. Do you remember this joke? People say no, and you have to keep asking people. So one of the things about being a reader was that you talk to other readers, because you're like, did you read Nine Princes of Amber? Like, yeah. What do you think that Jeweler's Rouge? Oh, yeah, that you use rouge to polish a stone. You're like, oh, you do? Oh, cool. So how do you know that? It's like, well, my uncle. Okay, it's fascinating. Anyway, so he goes to Earth to get Jeweler's Rouge. But the idea, and which, it's a trick. I'm not going to tell you the answer to that. You got to go read the books. I mean, it'll take you, like, you'll read Nine Princes of Amber, and one day it'll be read, boom, it'll be over. You'll be like, oh, give me more, Tim. I'm like, yes, Guns of Avalon. I recommend ordering the first 3 books at the same time. Third book is the Sign of the Unicorn, I think. And they are great, and they are very good. But basically, in the second book, Corwin begins to feel, is this all there is? What's going on here? And there's a black path that invades Amber, and they're like, what's this thing? And it's because they're not all aware of it, and so on. And it's trouble. It's what's happened. But the fundamental idea is really Platonic, and so that Amber is apparently the reality. It is the thing, and it casts shadows around it. So there's some light source, presumably from within Amber, and everything around Amber is a shadow of Amber. So Amber is an object. Now, it's really hard to imagine this. You'd have to you have to work with different images in your mind, like what's going on here. So this is why the shadow walks, or when Corwin starts to walk in shadow. What he's doing is he begins to leave Amber and move into shadow. And the further out he moves into shadow, the further away from reality he gets, capital R reality. And this really is a Platonic construct, where for Plato, you probably remember, there was what Plato conceived of as the world of forms. And he said that what we have in this world is the world of copies. That what our reality is basically a copy of the real, capital R real. And we're living in appearance. So we are always being fooled. This is why we disagree, because we're not living in the world of purity. We're living in a world of perception, and perception lies to us. You can't trust your eyes. You can only trust your reason, basically. So you can't trust your senses. Well, Amber is the same fundamental thing, where at the center of Amber is reality, and everything around Amber is not. So the Earth is some number of removes from Amber. So what we thought was our reality turns out to be just a bad imitation of the reality of Amber. So when they shift from this is why, and this is a really cool idea. I mean, Zelazny must have, he hit the jackpot when he had this. It's ironically, it's a very basic idea to Platonic. This is, if you've read Plato, you're like, oh yeah, there's a reality, and then everything else is a version of that reality, which is corrupt in some way. Well, you can just imagine Zelazny saying, what if, there was a version of reality, and there were these princes, and they got into a bar fight. They got into the way families do. They started fighting amongst themselves, and they weren't so good to each other. And what if there was a power struggle in reality? What would happen to the worlds of appearance? The worlds of appearance would presumably then reflect and be shocked by the central reality. And of course, the sort of what you can see coming next is that maybe Amber isn't the real reality either. And which is Zelazny will sort of keep, because he has to keep pulling magic out of the hat, basically, because writers are really magicians in very many ways. Ironically, many writers are fantasists, whether or not they're writing science fiction or fantasy, it doesn't really matter. But anyway, So this concept of there being shadows, which are then, so there's slight shadow, more shadow, more shadow, which is why when they're driving from Earth to, and Blaze knows how to get them there. I think it's Blaze. Forgive me if I'm wrong. Maybe Fiona, who takes Corwin in, and she begins to shift the reality around them. And as she does it, they can only make a certain number of shifts at any given time. It's tiring, it's exhausting, and so on. And so they shift slowly as they're driving through the day. They begin to drive into reality. So it's this very cool thing, right? So after a while, Corwin is like, what if there's another reality? What if Amber isn't the real thing? Maybe it itself is a copy. So this is fundamental Platonism. And once you have a sort of idea of that, then you can really have fun with seeing whose version of the truth is the real one, and so on. And Corwin is a very charming, roguish, fellow. So he's a good character, very piratical. He would not be played by Johnny Depp. There was a time when Johnny Depp would have done a good job, but not anymore. But that's for another day. Nine Princes and Amber. Zelazny, Zelazny, Zelazny.